So, you were to have read today the section on classification. There's just a small section, right, on categorization. And then the next section on, well, it's basically on the Enuma Elish, the Mesopotamian creation myth. Okay, now that's the most archaic of creation myths that we have in written form in anything approaching a state of completeness. And so it's interesting from the historical perspective because it's so archaic. It's also, like the Mesopotamians had an extraordinarily well-developed dogma, religious dogma, as far as I've been able to determine. In some ways, well I think in many ways, Jewish and Christian theology are elaborations on a Mesopotamian theme. Now, Iliad points out that the Mesopotamian creation myth, although it's about 5,000 years and old in its extant form, is definitely based on oral traditions that are much older than that. So it's not like you can say that the Sumerians just originated the Enuma Elish in a very brief period of time on ground that hadn't been prepared. They just codified traditions that had been handed down orally to that date, and so we have them in written form. Now, the first thing I wanted to tell you about was this notion of categorization. And I think this is... Roger Brown pointed out 20 years ago or thereabouts that we have always in psychology tended to think that the way that people think is the way that scientists think, and the way that we categorize things is in terms of the categories that we think are appropriate from the scientific or the logical perspective. Brown points out that this is, well, that a minimal amount of investigation, basically in the psycholinguistic domain, immediately indicated that this was in fact false, and that we do not categorize things naturally the way that people do scientifically. In other words, we don't use the notion of the proper set, and he uses as a standard example of the proper set the idea of triangles. And you can tell what a triangle is, absolutely. You can define what's a triangle and what isn't. There's no fuzziness about the borders, and everything either fits in the set or is outside of the set. And by contrast, our natural categories don't seem to be of that type. They have fuzzy boundaries, and they're more concerned with function, so to speak, or with affective relevance than with sensory, than with absolutely determinable sensory essence. So we categorize in much more vague manner, and it seems to me that it's, I gave you a listing in this document of the qualities of natural categorization as they've been described by George Lakoff in his book, Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. And Lakoff is basically following up on a tradition that is, I'm not a psycholinguist, and this is all news to me, basically, but Lakoff has been following up on a tradition that was established by Roger Brown and Eleanor Roche, who was one of his students, and Eleanor Roche has made a big name for herself studying categorization. The thing I think so interesting about this is that what Roche and Lakoff describe as categories are very, very much like the kinds of categories that religious thinkers have used that have been studied from a completely different perspective by people like Jung and Mircea Eliade. So it's not that surprising if you think about it, because it's obvious that religious categories aren't proper sets. They're natural categories. Archaic people think in religious categories and have always thought that way. So it's not like it's not that surprising. What's surprising, I guess, more surprising, is that the overlap between the two literatures is not well explored or known. So the first thing we should do, I guess, is think about this notion of categorization. Yeah. Okay, Lakoff describes natural categories as cognitive models. The first thing he says is that they are embodied with regards to their content, which essentially means that they can be used without necessarily being defined. It means that they are implicit in action without necessarily being implicit in description. So basically what Lakoff is pointing out is that if you act towards a number of different things as if they are the same thing with regards to your actions, then you are in fact treating those objects as if they're in the same category, because one domain of category can be like significance for motor output. And that's, if you think about it, it's like what defines chair. because chairs vary in all sorts of ways. I mean, they vary so much that there may be very little sensory overlap between one chair and another. There's not much similar between a stump, for example, and the kind of designer chair that you might see in a museum. They're very different objects, but the thing they have in common is their implication for output, which is that chairs are things that you can sit on. Right? They're defined by their significance, not by their sensory nature. So I used an example here. What makes a dog? You might say, I can't say, but I know one when I see one, which is another indication that you'd be using a natural category. Dog is something friendly, something to be petted, and something to play with. Although such knowledge does not comprise everything that makes up what you regard as dog. The thing that's interesting about those ideas, something friendly, something to be petted, and something to play with, is that, in a sense, those are not precisely attributes of the dog. Think of the natural category of dog. Because if you define a dog as a friend or as something to play with, you're actually defining the object in terms of your interactions with it, and not in terms of the object. And a lot of the terms we use have exactly that nature, like beautiful, for example. It says when you define it, say if you define another person as beautiful, it's very difficult to tell exactly where it is that that quality resides. I mean, people say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We know there's quite a substantial amount of cultural variation in terms of attitudes towards beauty, so it's very difficult to pin down what constitutes beauty from the objective perspective. I mean, there's been a certain attempts to do that, and they've been somewhat successful. But the point is that as beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but it's something that we naturally attribute to an object. So a lot of the things that we consider properties of objects are actually what Lakoff describes as interactional properties. They're things that we attribute to the thing that actually arise as a consequence of our interaction with the thing. So, like the notion of friend. When you describe, if you put someone in the category of friend, you're actually describing them in terms of your pattern of interactions with them, although you attribute the qualities that make up those interactions to them, and you do that automatically. And what I'm suggesting with regards to this study of categorization is that we do that. That is the natural way that we think, is we think about things in terms of their implication for our behavioral output. And we need to do that because that's what adaptation means. If you've adapted to something, you've structured your behavior. Well, basically what you've done is structure your behavior in the presence of that thing so that it does what you want it to do, which means basically that it doesn't threaten you, that it doesn't hurt you, that it furthers your progress towards a goal, or that it constitutes that goal itself. That's behavioral adaptation. And, well, those things, the things that make up that category of objects to which you've structured behavioral adaptation, that's explored territory. That's the domain of the known. Say, in that domain is everything that you understand how to act towards. Now, what I'm trying to suggest in the course of this whole manuscript is that's how your brain works. Like, the scientific overlay of scientific categorizations is just a thin veneer on top of that, and in some sense it's an irrelevant veneer from the perspective of emotional regulation. Science has enabled us to describe things ever more accurately so that we can keep track of them. But still, what we're interested in is determining how to behave in the presence of things. That's what we want to know. Okay. Now, Lakoff points out a few other things about natural categories, and I want you to think about this in regards to the sorts of categories that we're going to talk about for the remainder of the course. He says they're characterized by basic level categorization and basic level primacy. And basically what he means by that is that we tend to view things as in a category or as objects themselves if they're the right size for us. In other words, that the world that we perceive, which is the world of experience, which is in some sense the only world you can get access to, is human-sized. There are categories that naturally spring to mind because they're handy. That's a good way of thinking. That's like the English imperial system of measurement. We define things in terms of the English imperial system. And it's very handy, literally. A foot is a foot long. An inch is the length of one digit. I mean, the point Lakoff is trying to make is that the world of experience presents itself the way it presents itself because of the interaction between our physiology and whatever it is that's out there. Now, one of the things we're going to try to explore is what does it mean to say whatever it is that's out there. I mean, we tend to think of it scientifically as the objective world, which would be exactly the same as it is now if none of us were here, except that none of us would be here. The point Lakoff is trying to make is that what we define as reality is somewhat more, or what we experience as reality is more complex than that. It's an interaction between whatever it is that's out there and us. And everything that we think of as real, we define in terms of our experience of temporal duration and size and weight. And I guess the only way you can get your mind around this to some degree is to try to think of what Lakoff is saying, in a sense, is that the fact that we're human and have the characteristics that we have, which are basically our limitations, means that the universe is constituted in a particular way with regards to us, is that we have a built-in level of analysis. It's obviously not the subatomic level or the molecular level. It's not the cosmic level either. It's human-sized. Now, if you start thinking about what would constitute reality in the absence of a human observer, the first problem that you run into is the problem of a reference point. Is you no longer have anything against which to judge things like duration or size, and certainly not things like color or beauty or emotional significance. I mean, those categories obviously disappear. What happens to the sensory categories is not all that easy to figure out either. So I really can't figure it out.
Richard Feynman, in his book The Character of Physical Law, discusses encoding the nature of human experience in a mathematical form and sending it to alien so that he could reconstruct the world that we experience based on the proportion of an elemental character, or an element like an atom or something like that. And he gives a fairly good, just from that, it's convincing that you could describe the world independent of human experience. If you define
the parameters that make up our capacity to experience, is that?
If you could possibly describe the world that the world in terms of something which is transhuman by using mathematical symbols.
Well, that's interesting. So Feynman says that he would define our level of analysis mathematically as well as what it is that we are experiencing, and that would give an alien the capacity to see what it is that we see.
He wasn't talking about. He was talking about a transhuman reality. Feynman doesn't subject the reality of reality to the presence of the subject.
Right. Right. Well,
but nonetheless, that alien is a subject. I mean, and must have some sort of intelligence that is, at least in some vague way, like our own, in order to interpret what we send out there. So he's really not.
He's not getting rid of the problem of the reference point.
So there's an alien out there who has a similar enough intelligence to ours that can understand this thing that we've sent out. I mean, then they're the subject in question.
Well, it opens up it draws question to. I mean, it sort of puts a question mark over the possibility of saying that reality is dependent on, that it's irrelevant, or it's ridiculous to talk about reality in the absence of a human subject.
Well, transhuman, yes, but trans-subject, no.
Okay, well...
There's also a difference between Richard Feynman.
Okay, well, I don't want to make too much of this because it isn't like... It's not something that's critical to the arguments that we're gonna undertake. One of the things I want to tell you about is how mythological categories represent the category of all things that exist in the absence of a subject, which is kind of a strange category. And even the mythological, like in the scientific world, we presume an objective independent reality. I certainly don't want to argue about that because it's way too complicated an issue. But myth also presumes that something exists in the absence of a perceiver, or in the absence of a subject, although the thing that exists is very difficult to define, and that's one of the things we're going to take a brief look at today, because...
My question is, what does size have to do at all with that?
Science?
No, the size of the reference point, and that which presents itself to the reference.
Well, all that Lakoff is basically saying is that certain categories seem to present themselves to us more naturally than others. Like the category cat presents itself to us more naturally than the category of species of cat. Because we're naturally predisposed, so to speak, towards making an object out of something like a cat. Now, no one knows exactly why it is that certain forms of categorization appear to us more naturally than other sorts. I suspect it has something to do with, well, you can say, but it has something to do with our biological hardwiring, which is not really much of an answer. It's just the way we are. We perceive certain things more accurately than we perceive other things. I mean, just to take a trivial example, in this room, we'll focus all of our attention on each other's faces. Like, I'm not going to spend a lot of time when I'm talking to you looking at your hands. My natural point of orientation in our discussion is your face. It's very significant for me. And I think you see this sort of thing if you look at children's drawings. I mean, a child's drawing of a person is, usually something like this. Maybe there's not even a body, but the head is 90% of the person, and the face is 90% of the head. And that's, I think, this is a proto-linguistic representation of a human being. Children tend to produce these sorts of figures spontaneously. I would say that's kind of a natural hieroglyphic that stands for person. And the things that are most relevant about the person are the things that are focused in on by the child. It's just certain things appear to us more naturally than other things, and those things more naturally constitute our world. So,
As long as we're talking about size really quickly, if you return to physics and what's intuitive, you can sort of look at you can sort of divide the universe into three very basic levels of orders of magnitude. You can have sort of what's intuitive is the Newtonian universe we all live in, and you can have the cosmic order, which is sort of defined by Einsteinian mechanics and space-time, and you can go to quantum mechanics, which is smaller than you could possibly perceive. And if you look at the mathematics involved in each one, the Newtonian equations are the ones that make sense to you, that you think in, and the other ones seem like, when you read about them the first time, you think to yourself, how could this be? But in a sort of mathematical sense, they're all true.
That's an
but only
excellent
one is
example.
relevant.
Because that's an excellent example. Because the Newtonian universe is intuitive. And the reason that it's intuitive from the Lacoffian perspective is that the laws are in accordance with our motor patterns, our patterns of adaptation. I mean, Piaget's pointed out that we first adapt to objects from the motoric perspective as a consequence of exploration. Then we build our abstract notions about our relationships with those objects as a consequence of our established motor patterns. And that basically sums up the notion of embodied knowledge. And your point is that these other universes are counterintuitive. They're not in accordance with our experience. Well, that's partly because they aren't the levels of resolution or the orders of magnitude towards which we actually adapt our behavior. So, yeah. Okay. Anyways, you can finish reading through the properties of natural categories. They have interesting categories. I also think that, well, membership and centrality gradients is kind of an interesting category, as is familial resemblance. The idea of familial resemblance is quite interesting. And basically what Mrs. Rosh's big contributor, the thing that she's worked on, say that we have notions of prototypes for our categories, is that there's kind of an ideal thing that constitutes the category, like the category bird. People would say, for example, that a robin is a more prototypical bird than an ostrich. And you can't exactly, sorry, do you have a question?
Yeah. Well, maybe it's not really related to what you're saying right this second, but do we sort of subconsciously come up with different categories than, or find things easier to categorize than what we sort of, I mean, now we'd all look at each other's faces, but if you have dreams, you can sort of identify somebody even if they look completely differently. You can say, and I knew in my dream this was supposed to be your father, even though he looked like my math teacher. And maybe are we sort of getting at a different subconscious sort of essence of people than when we...
In a dream?
Yeah.
Or, I don't know. I know what you're saying. People, yeah.
There must be some other category, some other way of categorizing.
Yeah, I guess what happens in a situation in a dream like that is that you have two conflicting categorizations and one takes predominance. So you say, despite all these exceptions, the prototypical aspects of this, whatever it is, are still intact. So you'd have to look at the individual differences in the dreams to be able to determine exactly how that happens. But the prototypical Smith brother, this is your classic example, is that how do you identify family members as coming from all from the same family? So, well, you have all these Smith brothers, maybe there's 5 of them, and you can all tell they're brothers, but they don't share the same complete set of characteristics. The prototypical brother maybe has 6 characteristics, so you might say, well, a big nose would be 1, and a heavy mustache would be another, and a beard would be a 3rd, and big ears would be a 4th, and heavy eyebrows would be a 5th, and glasses, say, would be a sixth. So that's your prototypical Smith brother. But to be recognizable as a Smith brother, perhaps you only have to have 2 of these characteristics and the rest can vary. So this character would have big ears and the eyes and maybe the mustache, but he'd have a little nose and no beard. And then this character would have the glasses and a big nose and mustache, but little ears and say a beard. And anyways, you get the idea. And they don't share, they're not like triangles. You can't precisely define the characteristics that the Smith brothers have. Theoretically, they all relate to this central prototype, which we abstract from our experience in some complex manner. So the notion of, what else is interesting? Well, the other thing about natural categories is that instead of being distinct like proper sets, is they can overlap. And this is part of the reason that, well, knowing this helps you make sense out of mythological categories, because they shift with context. Unfortunately, that makes them difficult to interpret. For example, one of the most basic divisions of the world from the mythological perspective is masculine versus feminine. And that's related in a very profound way to explored territory versus unexplored territory. The problem is that whether or not something is masculine or feminine tends to depend on the context of interpretation. So for example, if you talk about an island and the ocean, then the island is masculine and the ocean is feminine. But if you talk about an island and the sky, then the island is feminine and the sky is masculine. So even though the island is theoretically objectively the same in both circumstances, its affective classification shifts with context. Now you might think, well, that's a bizarre property for a categorization to have. But the thing is, we do this all the time. This is actually how we derive meaning in large part. It's always context dependent. Like most of the words you know, you don't know because someone told you the meaning of them. You know because you derive the meaning from the context. You see a novel word in one context, and then in another context, and then in another context, and you can derive the meaning from analysis of what's common across the context. Right? Maybe you could define a novel word if you saw it in 10 different sentences. You'd have enough information there to figure out what the word means. And the meaning of the word shifts with the sentence, and the meaning of the sentence shifts with the paragraph, and the meaning of the paragraph shifts with the essay. That's why you can pull things out of context and reverse their meaning often. So the fact of context-dependent meaning is not that much of a mystery.
Does everything have effective significance? Like, I'm a little confused because when you see a door or something, okay, now someone can say that they see a door and it has, you know, it has sensory, you know, information, like it's a door, you open and close it, but they feel nothing towards it.
Right.
But does it have a value? Does
Well,
it
it's
have
only,
a
it's always, that's what, last week, for example, we talked about the relationship of things to your story. Right, you have your story, and like if part of your ideal future is...
So it doesn't have any relevance unless it interferes with the story?
Not only interferes with, if it aids you.
Yeah,
Like
or
you
if it
think,
helps you,
look,
then it's good.
again, whatever, it looks to me like your cortex evolved in part to modulate the automatic reactions of your limbic system to stimuli, to make you more flexible. It looks to me like what's happened is that what your cortex has done is hijack your limbic system in this way. It says, you can put anything you want into the goal box, but as soon as you put it there, it's a consummatory reward. It doesn't matter what it is. Now, you have a lot of underlying biological systems that have their own idea about what should be here. But you can still put whatever you want in there. It's a consummatory reward. Now, as soon as you do that, everything that you encounter is construed in relationship to that goal. So the door is only relevant if you need to get through it, to get to where you want to go. Right now, it's not relevant.
So
At the end of class, it will be.
doesn't have
Absolutely.
Okay, that's what I didn't.
And you shift the significance of things by shifting your framework of reference. And what we're trying to define is what constitutes a framework of reference. That's one thing. What is a framework of reference? Like I would say, in terms of natural categories, everything within here is of one type of thing, and everything outside of it is of a completely different type of thing. And I've tried to define that as the known and the unknown. Or you could say as, and I really think this is, I've been trying to chase, say, categories have this central prototype. And there's all sorts of mythological categories. Masculine is one category and feminine is another. sky is a category, and earth is a category, matter is a category, and water is a category. These things overlap in some odd way, like sky tends to be related to masculine, for example. I've been trying to chase down what's at the core of these mythological categories, and that's why I've come up with these terms. It's known, unknown, and then there's the process of mediation, that's the knower. Or you could say, and maybe this is even more fundamental, the unknown is unexplored territory. The known is explored territory. And the knower is the explorer. And that's how we conceive of the world. The world is made of this, and this. That's it. That's how our brain naturally organizes things.
How come, I was a little confused, how come the heavens or the sky is considered masculine and hence we would think known territory? Because compared to the earth, it seems like it's more unknown.
Good question. Good question. I'll have to think about that. Part of the answer, there's two masculine categories, and that's part of the answer, is that explored territory tends to be the king, usually the old king, like Osiris, for example. Whereas the knower tends to be masculine as well. That's usually the sun, that's Horus, say, or Marduk. And these are usually sky gods. They're assimilated to the sun. The sun is assimilated to consciousness. So that's basically the answer to that. The sky is the domain of the sun. The sun is masculine. Why is the sun masculine? Well, because it's associated with consciousness, illumination, enlightenment. It rules during the times when we are conscious. It's also the thing that fights the dragon of chaos in the night, hacks its way out of the belly of the beast, and then is reborn again in the morning. So that's the answer to that question.
I could think of a way that the sky could be explored territory relative to the earth for people who never thought of going up in the sky. The sky is not something you move through, but something that's over you. And to that extent, it is explored. It's very predictable. And even if you move a great distance across the earth, the sky stays relatively the same, whereas the earth changes dramatically.
Right. Yeah, that could be as well. It's also the case, you have to remember, and this is one of the things that makes analysis of mythological symbols tricky. They do shift with context, and they're not always culturally stable. For the Sumerians, the sky was male and the earth was female. But for the Egyptians, the sky was female and the earth was male. That's more rare. But it does happen. What seems to be, well, so you have to look for the prototype that's at the core of this to try to make sense out of the shifting relationships. So the Mother Earth notion is more common. But the fatherland is also a mythological notion, right? We fight for the fatherland, we fight for the motherland. Those two ideas have slightly different slants.
It seems that to call the explored the predictable and the unexplored the unpredictable might be just as fundamental.
Yes, fair enough. That's a perfectly reasonable way of looking at it as well. And that's basically where you see the neuropsychological overlap instantly, because we do know now that your emotional systems are a priori hardwired to respond to the unpredictable. That's a domain. Now it looks to me like, in terms of neuropsychological function, that the left hemisphere, the linguistic hemisphere, it's specialized for habitual patterns of action. It looks to me like it's the hemisphere that rules in known territory. You say, well, your brain is actually wired up so that it has one set of responses that are useful when you know what the hell you're doing. And then it has a whole other set of subsystems that are useful when you don't know what you're doing. And when you do know what you're doing, it's the linguistic left that's you. And when you don't know what you're doing, it's the limbically dominated right hemisphere that appears to mediate your actions. Now, why would I say that? Well, it's partly because we know the right frontal cortex responds to punishment and threat. And punishment and threat are the a priori phenomena that appear with the appearance of the unpredictable. So the right hemisphere is what governs your behavioral responses when you encounter something that you can't predict. In terms of its more cognitive functions, well, it governs anxiety, that's for sure. It may govern pain, that's not so clear, but it looks like there's a high possibility of it. It governs depression anyways. It's also the part of your brain that's good at recognizing patterns and generating stories. And my guess is, you can think about this, if you encounter something you don't understand, the first thing you try to do is to figure out how it's like other things you've already encountered, which is basically to say that when you're first trying to adapt to something that you can't predict, you try to apprehend in it familiar patterns. Say, well, even people do this with the sky. You know, that's how we get constellations. You have this massive undiscovered territory that constitutes the night sky. You chunk it into patterns, and that makes it identifiable. And you have stories that revolve around the patterns, and you start to move the information from the domain of the unknown into the domain of familiar territory. And when you think about it, the right hemisphere is the hemisphere that seems to be specialized for stories and for fantasy. And it is, fantasy is hypothesis generation as far as I can tell. Fantasy is the story of, well, maybe it's like this. And your right hemisphere seems to be good for that. So then you have a nice set of functions. It's the thing that is activated when you encounter something unpredictable. So it stops you, makes you shut up and look. And then the next thing it does is start thinking. It's specialized for global pattern recognition. It wants to give you a quick and dirty answer. What's out there? Well, the right hemisphere thinks, well, it's like this, it's like this, it's like this, it's like this, and it gives you a picture. So you get something like Kelly, who we'll encounter a little bit later, who's a monster that inhabits the unknown, that's basically composed of determinate things that are frightening. So like Kelly, who's the goddess of the unknown, she has staring face, big teeth, she sits in fire, she has 8 legs like a spider. She's a picture of the thing that lives out there in the unknown. Anyways, okay, back to...
Can you elaborate more
Yes.
on how the left hemisphere works in the presence of the known?
Well, it seems to be more specialized for information that you already know how to handle, and it's also good at handling linguistically mediated information. And by the time you've chopped up the world into units that you can describe with words, you've already done a pretty good job of adapting to it. You can even abstractly represent it. If you're still, I think, action is a form of categorization. If you really don't know something, all you know about it is that in its presence you should stop or run. That's a form of categorization. It's pretty generalized information, right? By the time you've explored something really thoroughly, you can describe it in words and you can communicate it. And that seems to be part of what the left hemisphere does. But it's also responsible, you think about it this way. The left frontal hemisphere is also responsible for the generation of positive affect. Now, you only generate positive affect in the presence of cues of consummatory reward, in the presence of incentive rewards. Now, an incentive reward is something that indicates that you're getting closer to your goal, okay? Now, explored territory is basically full of indications that you're getting closer to your goal. That's why it's explored, right? Because you've already transformed it from something unknown and threatening into something that you can use to get to where you want to go. And the left hemisphere does that. So it looks to me like, well, it looks to me like those things all sort of fit together. So adaptation basically means, in its most optimal sense, adaptation means that you have transformed something you do not understand into something that you can not only predict, but can use. Because you just don't want to transform everything into something irrelevant, right? That would be useless. You want to transform things you don't understand into things that you can do something with that you want to do. So
every individual has a different balance through which they approach, like the balance between the left and right hemisphere, or the approach to the known and the unknown.
Well, there's some evidence for variation in temperament. You know, some people are more inhibited and some people are less inhibited. Now, the problem with that is that, I believe that. I mean, it does look like there's pretty solid evidence for these temperamental variations. So you might say that you have a lower threshold, for example, for experiencing anxiety in the presence of something unknown than the next person does, and that's constant across situations. The problem with that is that it doesn't take into account the fact that what's unexpected is always construed in relationship to a story. My guess is that if people looked into this, they'd find that inhibited people have different stories about the way the world is constructed, and part of their biological predisposition towards timidity manifests itself in the structure of the stories they tell themselves about the world. It makes sense, because if you're more frightened by people, the stories you tell about them are going to be twisted more towards the domain of threat.
So does that balance also vary situationally? Like you said, if someone is refusing to accept anomalous information that does have relevance for their story, and they're ignoring it until it gets to a certain point where they can, where it sort of forces their...
Yeah, I think the whole last half of the course is about that. It's like, because one of the things that you can do to yourself to make yourself more pathological is just not adapt to anomalous information, and that makes you functionally pathological, I think.
So would that actually make the right hemisphere less reactive, or would it make it
It would
more
make, it would make the,
reactive? I mean, is it
I
like
don't know.
is it a compensating function, or is it?
I think what happens under those circumstances is the right hemisphere starts to make a lot of noise. So your dreams start to, one of the students I had in a class, this class last year has just written a paper for me on the potential function of dreams. He points out that in neural net modeling of pattern recognition, there's a phenomenon called catastrophic failure, where if you have a neural net and it's got a bird category and a fish category, and you throw in a penguin, well, what happens is that the bird category and the fish category collapse, and all you get is animal category. So there's kinds of anomalous information that will blow whole categorization systems. So what he posited was that there's one system that does categorization, and another that slowly feeds it anomalous information, so it doesn't collapse, so it has time to adjust its structure to the new anomalous information without blowing its whole categorization scheme. Now, you have to have a categorization scheme, because if you don't know how to act. And if it's really global, like if I tell you, you say, well, how do I write an essay? And I say, you act like a human being. So this information is so vague as to be completely useless for the task at hand. You want to categorize it, you want information that's of sufficiently high resolution so that it'll aid you in your task. If I blow all your categorization sets and you're just left with this really amorphous categorization, you don't know how to act. So you want to maintain your categories. What he suggested was that dreams slowly move anomalous information up into the categorization schemes. So, in terms of your question, well, if you constantly ignore anomalous information pouring in from the right hemisphere, basically what you've done is categorize more and more information into the category of things that are so terrible they can't be faced. And I think what you do under those circumstances is you activate a monster, so to speak, that lives in your right hemisphere. And it gets more and more and more powerful until one day, when at a weak moment, say, it just swallows you whole. And that's when you fall catastrophically into depression or into terrible anxiety, or maybe even, depending on your physiological predisposition, into something resembling schizophrenia. So because all that information that you've encountered that's anomalous, it's categorized. You categorize it by avoiding it. And the category is so terrible, I can't face it.
So you think that if you integrate it, you don't end up with nightmares?
Yes, that's right. That's right. Although, if you haven't been integrating it and you start, the nightmares might increase in intensity. Yeah, it's also the case that when you are dreaming, your spinal cord, your reticular activating system in part, is activating the hippocampus and the amygdala. And that's the part of the brain that deals with anomalous information. It reverts to brainstem control. So it looks to me like this is a reasonable hypothesis. You have a system that deals with what you know, and another one that deals with what you don't know. You need both. If you ignore one, well, there's a whole social psych literature that says if you ignore anomalous information, you're happier. Which is that's a really appalling literature, because they don't take temporal duration into consideration. It's real good in the short term.
And what literature
It's really,
is this?
oh, there's a whole.
What kind of?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The positive illusion literature is Taylor.
Taylor and
Taylor,
Brock.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's being trashed with empirical data showing that, yeah, in the short term it's a good solution, but in the long term, you get hostile and anxious and depressed, and people don't like you very much, which is, hardly all that surprising. But they actually wrote self-help books. You know that? Self-help books telling people that positive self-illusions were good for mental health. Man, despite like 5,000 years of philosophical evidence to the contrary.
With both of these hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere, working at the same time when you come across experience, what would happen to a split brain patient? Has there been any?
Well, we do know, for example, that I don't know the literature on emotional responsivity of split brain patients, but I do know that if you sustain right frontal cortical damage, it makes you inappropriately non-depressed and anxious. And what happens under those circumstances is that you acquire functional psychopathy, which basically means that psychopath doesn't regulate his behavior as a consequence of information that indicates that his behavioral output is doing something that in the long run is a bad idea. Well, there's a famous paper by Eslinger and Damasio about a guy who, can't remember his initials. He had an IQ of 143, right frontal damage. No measurable decrements in IQ, so he's still, 143 is 3 standard deviations above the mean. We're talking a very bright person here. But he makes series of catastrophic decisions that are of the sort that you'd associate with stupid criminality. He gets divorced, he marries well, someone who's very bad for him, basically. Gets involved in a whole series of terrible business decisions, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're missing the information from your right frontal cortex, you're happy, no kidding, because you've knocked out the whole system that deals with all those things that make you unhappy. But you have to be unhappy to live properly when you encounter those things that don't go out according to plan, because if you don't attend to those things that don't occur according to plan, then you don't learn. And if you don't learn, you keep your model of adaptation stable in the face of shifting environmental contingencies. And what that basically means is that over time, the thing that's you gets old and senile. And that's how it's represented in mythology, by the way. That's the image of the wasteland. So, you know, that's the land where all the trees have dried up and everything's old and nothing grows. And you can read that as the absence of the positive aspect of the Great Mother, which means that there's no beneficial novelty around, or you can read that as the tyranny of stupid ideology.
So
either way.
Are you suggesting that in the absence of connection, the left brain will dominate probably?
Well, one of the things about
Yes, I think that's true. Like, this is speculative, but there's some physiological evidence. Like the left brain, the left hemisphere is dominant in most circumstances. In schizophrenia, for example, if you're schizophrenic and you start hearing voices, it appears as though there's a possibility that the reason for that is because the areas that are isomorphic with the language centers but are in the right hemisphere have been released from tonic inhibition by the language centers in the left hemisphere and are starting to become active. And the way you interpret that is, I hear voices, they aren't me. So which suggests to me that who you are, as far as you're concerned, is mostly the sum total of linguistically mediated processes that localize, usually the left hemisphere, but mostly they're linguistically mediated. Which is only to say that mostly what you are, as far as your own self-regard, is a culturally constructed entity, most of which has been constructed using the mediation of language.
So do you think consciousness resides in the left hemisphere?
No, because first of all, there isn't consciousness. There's a bunch of processes that are consciousness. Now, like one consciousness that's clearly conscious is what happens to you when something anomalous occurs, because you'll orient towards that. And I think orienting is most central to what we define as consciousness. Because like even in this room, look, there's only a few things that you're really conscious of. You're very much not conscious as a general rule of the floor, the ceiling, the walls, most things around you. The only thing you're conscious of is that part of your experiential field where there's some novelty emerging, right? That's because your orienting systems are activated. And those are critical to consciousness. And this is very interesting because in mythology, one of the things that brings about the world is the capacity to discriminate between things, the capacity to attend to novelty. Well, I want to get into that in the course of today's discussion, actually. See, look, when you're orienting towards things, you're attending to the world that's defined by chaos and transforming it with the intermediation of exploration into defined territory. From the mythological perspective, that's equivalent to the construction of the world. Now that's why in Christian theology, for example, there's the doctrine of the Logos. The Logos is being assimilated to consciousness. It's a solar-like entity mediated by language. That's why it's the Word. It's also assimilated to Christ. And this is not a notion that's unique to Christianity, as we'll see. That's the thing that creates the world. It creates the world by dividing. Look, here's an example. In the earliest Sumerian myths, there's a dragon who lives in the primordial waters. And he gives rise to two wedded deities. One's the sky, and the other's the earth. They're separate, but not really. And the way the myth represents that is that they're locked in something technically called a hieros gamos, which is a mystical marriage. So they're in sexual union, they're united. They're not really two things. Their union gives rise to a third force. That's their sun, the god of the atmosphere, as it turns out in the Sumerian myth. It's the god of the atmosphere who separates, pushing the sky up to the sky and the earth down to the earth, and thereby creates the world. What the hell does that mean? Well, it means that in any creation myth, there's 4 elements. Chaos. And what's chaos? That's the union of everything that will at one point be distinct. And it's sometimes represented in mythology by the union between the mother and the infant, because that's sort of symbiotic, right? One's absolutely dependent on the other, but yet, in a sense, they're 2 distinct entities, or they will be 2 distinct entities. But anyways, chaos. That's the dragon that lives at the bottom of the water. It gives rise to 2 deities, the earth and the sky. They're locked in sexual union. They give rise to a sun, the god of the atmosphere. It's the sun god. He separates them. That's the world. Now you could say that the world is born as a consequence of the interaction of the sky god and the earth god. Or you could say that the world is born as a consequence of the fact that the sun god separates the 2. Both stories are accurate. All this story is saying, you have to look at the mythological representations. The stories say, well, the earth, this is chaos. The earth, that's maternal. That's the mother. That's novelty. It's the source of all things. Explored territory. The sun god separates these 2 things by discriminating between them, which is basically by taking the thing that's novel and transforming it into the thing that's explored. That means the origin of the cosmos from the mythological perspective. So there's three seminal elements in your standard creation myth: the mother, the father, and the son. The mother is the unknown, unexplored territory. The father is the known, explored territory. And the son is the process that mediates between them. And I've assimilated that to the orienting reflex, because it's the thing that focuses on novelty, initiates the process of exploration, which is the process by which the determinate world is formed. Think, well, what is the determinate world under those circumstances? Well, it's all those places that you can go where you know how to behave. And those places consist of the territory, but also the behaviors of everyone else that you interact with. So known territory is social territory, because all of our actions in the habitual domain are defined by the actions of others. So part of what it is that we know when we say we know is how to map the actions and interactions of others. So that's why the known is also assimilated to culture, and to the patriarchy, and to the king. Because of course the king is the behavioral model that defines the state, who everyone in the state imitates, so that everyone in the state can predict everyone else. Well, that's part of it anyways. So for me, you're explored territory, because I can define what you're going to do in this situation. And the reason I can define it is because we share the same story, which is that we're pursuing goals that are at least concordant. They don't conflict. If they conflicted, we'd have trouble, because you'd be mapping things with one motivational significance, and I'd be mapping them with the other, which basically means we'd either have to negotiate, which means you'd arrange your story and I'd arrange mine, or we fight. That's it. Those are the 2 options. Or I can pretend that the conflict doesn't exist, in which case, sooner or later, it will get me. Okay. Now, I want to, because this is a course about social identity and social conflict, I want to read you some, I'll get to you in one sec. I want to read you some things from Mircea Eliade, because it'll help you understand how it is that we naturally categorize things. So you want to remember chaos, because that's the thing that we're going to discuss. Now, chaos is what exists before there's a separation of subject and object. And the thing that chaos is then both spirit and matter. Terrible mythological way of speaking, but I'll give you an example of what that means. Piaget said that the subject constructs himself as well as the object in the course of exploration, which basically means that what you are formed out of is all those things that you've discovered as you were approaching all those things you didn't know. Now, you form the world as a consequence of the process of exploration, but you also form yourself, because it's in the process of encounter with novelty that you generate information. And it's information that you build yourself out of. So from the mythological world, the thing that's chaos that existed before the world existed is composed of spirit, which is what you will be, and matter simultaneously, which is that's a very interesting concept. Okay, question?
I don't want to go off in a different direction. No, the symmetry between the present goal process and then the state one chaos state two,
Yeah.
and then the unknown, knower, known.
Yeah,
So that the knower is in the place of the process.
the knower is the process. The
So
knower
it's-
is the
So the
process.
self becomes the mechanism which embodies the process.
Yes,
or something.
yes, that's right, that's right. And that's what religious stories basically push you towards. That's why I wanted to show you this story of Marduk. Marduk is the person who encounters the unknown, the god who attains the highest position in the hierarchy of gods, who then goes out to fight Tiamat, who's the dragon of both. She's both the dragon of chaos and the mother of all things. Those two categories get overlapped substantially. And in the fight with Tiamat, Marduk generates the cosmos. Now the Mesopotamian king imitates Marduk. That's what gives him power. That's what gives his position validity, is the fact that he's the embodiment of the sun god. Well, what does that mean? Well, the sun god is the thing that makes the world. Well, what does that mean? Well, the sun god is an image of the process of consciousness, which turns the unknown, which is undefined territory, into explored territory, which is the world. And as long as the king, so then the archaic people say, the state, if the king doesn't do his job, the state becomes sterile. Crops don't grow, for example. And you think, what the hell kind of attitude is that? If the king doesn't do his job, crops won't grow. Well, what it means is the king is a pattern of adaptation. If he doesn't constantly update his behavioral attributes in the face of shifting environmental contingencies, the beneficial aspect of the environment will disappear. So when the archaic people says, if the king doesn't do his job, then the state becomes senile, crops won't grow, they're dead right. What do? You kill the king, sacrifice the king, or he has to undergo a ritual that indicates sacrifice, which actually the king of Mesopotamia did every New Year's when he renewed the cosmos. He had to do that, because if he didn't renew the cosmos, which basically meant update his pattern of behavioral adaptation and representation, then the environment would drift farther and farther away from the state, and everything would collapse precipitously. So the king had to voluntarily encounter novelty, or in the long term, he would catastrophically encounter it along with all his people. Anyway, okay.
Last semester, didn't you relate that somehow to why money has value, or the use of coins?
Oh yeah, that's a funny one, all right. Well, a gold coin has the head of state on it. Why? Well, the gold is a symbol of the sun, and the sun is the sun god. And the emperor is put on the coin to indicate value, because this is the thing that is most valuable. And it's symbolic representations of that we've used to signify promise, basically. So, yeah. Gold has always been assimilated to the sun, at least in the West. So, okay. Now I want to read you some things from Eliade. I think these things are, well, from the perspective of social psychology and the notion of understanding conflict and the hopes for its resolution. These sorts of things I think are revolutionary if you understand their significance. Because Eliade basically describes how it is that people naturally perceive those who are not like them. Now I would say, well, if I'm like you, I share your story, okay? This is a castle, we're both inside it. I can construe your relationship to me with regards to our end goal. I also, and we'll get to this later, this is also a dominance hierarchy. Like this. Okay. The king's at the top of it, and every organization is set up that way. It's like, if you and I and 100 other people are pursuing the same goal, we organize ourselves into a dominance hierarchy. We each have a position that basically constitutes a sub-goal of that greater goal. And the utility of the goals are rank ordered in terms of their importance. And the person who's at the top is simultaneously the most important person in the dominance hierarchy and an embodiment of the goal. Chief executive officer in a corporation, for example. You could also relate that, in thinking about that this week, to the more complex story, remember, that looks like this. And so on. Now, the thing that's neat about this is also, you remember, does everybody remember how this works? Is that the story actually consists of sub-stories basically all the way down. Now, the higher you are up on the dominance hierarchy, the closer you are to the broadest expanse of this story. So if you're just a functionary in an organization, you have one of these stories. And anything that comes along to disrupt you, like if you get fired, is only going to bother people who are working on that particular sub-goal. Now, if you're the king, or the chief executive officer, you occupy this territory. So like in the case of a hostile takeover of a corporation, that means the whole structure is potentially disrupted, and everyone inside that structure feels anxiety and depression because their stories are being disrupted. Okay, now you can also see how groups form in relationship to this, because you're most tightly identified with those who share the broadest subset of your embedded stories. So, does that make sense?
Would you say that the response to Kennedy's assassination?
Right, perfect, exactly. More accurately, when the North Korean emperor died, people said the sun had set permanently. People were out in the street wailing and crying, you know, carrying around pictures of the sun god who disappeared because the whole state was placed into chaos. Right, the same thing happens when Stalin died, for example. When any tyrant dies, because the tyrant embodies the story of the state. Kill the tyrant, everything collapses. People come out in the streets and cry. Yeah. Fry points out that people like Queen Elizabeth still draw a crowd because lots of people still think in a medieval fashion, so to speak. But more accurately, Queen Elizabeth embodies our stories, everyone's story. She's the focal point, you could say, or she's the person who incarnates the abstracted stories. Now, so you could say that over top of her objective reality is laid, I don't know how you describe it, a glamorous facade that people see because of their subjective interpretations. And she acts out that role. That's right, that's projection. You could say that's a good example of projection. They think that what they're so excited about is the queen. It's her attributes. Well, you can say in a sense that's true. It's what she signifies for behavior. But that's not exactly a property of the object now, is it? Now, if you can understand that, you get very close to understanding what it is that archaic people were referring to when they were referring to a god. Because Queen Elizabeth, in a sense, is an incarnated god. And the more potent gods occupy broader domains of the story. Now, what the Mesopotamians said, and this is the core for religious stories in general, is that the thing that should be at the top of the hierarchy is Marduk, right? Marduk was elected by all the other gods to be the king god. He's the process by which anomaly is transformed into explored territory. And what that basically means that if in your hierarchy of values, what's placed above all else is the necessity of responding to anomaly every time it manifests itself, then all your other biological systems that determine value will operate properly. And if you put something else in the place of that God, so to speak, then sooner or later everything will fall into chaos. That's that. That's what those mythological stories are trying to tell people. That your attitude towards anomaly, that determines everything. And you have two choices. Either face it voluntarily or not. And if you don't, well, that's why we're reading Milton's Paradise Lost, because Milton's Paradise Lost is a story about the consequences of voluntary failure to admit to the existence of anomaly. Okay, now, so you see, you read the story of Marduk, the Sumerian myth, it's very, very interesting. Say all those gods They organize themselves into a dominance hierarchy, so they're threatened by Tiamat. She's the dragon of chaos. She constitutes unexplored territory. She's going to destroy all the gods. Creator gods always do that, and that's because the unknown generates everything and takes everything back. So it has this ambivalent motivational status, the source of everything and the place that everything returns to. It's a constant threat. It never goes away. There's always something you don't expect to deal with. The gods organize themselves into a hierarchy, and they put Marduk at the top. Then he's the king. Okay. It seems to me that what that story is telling you with regards to the construction of the dominance hierarchy is two things. Is first of all, the Mesopotamian society was the consequence of the intermingling of a whole set of cultural groups, each of whom had their own god, which is basically their own representation of the highest ideal, projected more or less into the external world. Now there was a lot of differences between these representations, but in the process of becoming one culture, all these gods had to fight it out, so to speak, for dominance in the territory defined by interpersonal communication. And the myth of Marduk climbing the dominance hierarchy is the story, the cumulative story, of the combat between these gods and the rise of one god to preeminent status. Now, you can see at the end here, yeah, on page 96, I don't know how many of you have your book, but Marduk still in the Sumerian myth, Mesopotamian myth, Marduk still has a whole bunch of sort of other names that were likely the names of gods who sooner or later became assimilated to Marduk. He sort of took over their domain. And the Mesopotamians said that Marduk had, I don't remember how many names, 50. And here are some of them. And so what the Mesopotamians basically concluded, unconsciously so to speak, was that whatever Marduk represented was also vital to what all these other names represented. And here are some of the names. He's Namtalaku, who's the god who restores to life. Okay, that is describing his role in the process that we have talked about. This. Okay. Chaos equals death. Now, when the Mesopotamians say Marduk is the god who restores to life, this is what they mean. He's this process. This being read as death. Stale state, death, rejuvenation. The process, that's Marduk. That's name number one. Who can restore all ruined gods as though they were his own creation. The God, Lord who by holy incantation restores the dead gods to life. Same thing. This is the dead gods. And you could say, well, why is that? All your behavioral patterns of adaptation are the consequence, in the final analysis, of your mimicry of all those people who came before you and established modes, exploration-driven modes of adaptation, which is to say that what you consist of in terms of your behaviors is the cumulative behaviors of your whole culture, insofar as those are being adaptively relevant. And most of those were established by people who are now dead, ancestral figures. In many religions, the ancestral figures are assimilated to gods, and that's because they determine your behavior. But anyways, the known is the domain of the dead gods. That's basically, there's an interesting little side, this piece of knowledge, I know about that. If you're completely identified with your culture, your ideology, it means you're the product of people who lived before you, not your own original thought, because you've adapted a dogma which defines you. It's not you. It's the construction of people who are dead. Ideologically, the catchword of an ideology is a slogan. Slogan is derived from the Welsh. Sluag Gerb. Sluag Gerb means battle cry of the dead, which is a nice commentary on ideology. Okay. Yes.
So it seems that, okay, so the right hemisphere seems to be what the process is doing, what the king is doing. They're the ones that are going out into the unknown, and they're the ones that are using what they find from the unknown for adaptive behavior.
Okay, hang on. What? No, that's not exactly right. Okay, look. Chaos, that's the dragon, so to speak. That's the possibility, that's the unknown before it's been contacted. It's the unknown hypothetically. It's the fact that behind everything that you know, there's this reality that you can't say anything about. something that you actually encounter that's unexpected, that's the manifestation of the unknown in your experience. That's an anomaly, okay? The right hemisphere is responsible for I think, in conjunction with the limbic system, is responsible for pointing out the fact of anomalies. Which is to say that if you're pursuing your goal-directed, linguistically mediated plans, and something you didn't expect occurs, then your septal, hippocampal, and amygdalic systems grab your motor behavior and your attention and force it towards the anomaly. Then you make a decision: process or ignore. And the thing that makes the decision, I think, is the left hemisphere. It's the thing that decides whether it will voluntarily make the descent or will reject it.
Huh. So then what is it that uses?
Because I think we experience chaos from the affective perspective when we're completely dominated by the processes of the right hemisphere, which is to say the affective aspects of chaos are basically anxiety, depression, and, well, I think the third category is sort of schizophrenic-like symptomatology. This is right hemisphere mediated. We do not like that. When your brain has flipped dominance from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere, you feel like dying. In fact, you might commit suicide. But that's part of the reason why people are very motivated not to pay any attention to anomaly. It's in its first manifestation, it's anxiety provoking and painful. But you have to balance that against knowledge that if you don't pay attention to it, all that will happen is that it will grow until instead of you facing it, it will attack you, likely when you're weak.
Okay, so you have this anomalous piece of information. The right hemisphere focuses on it. The left hemisphere says, go after it or ignore it. And then does it then call again to the right hemisphere to use patterns to identify it, etc.? And then
well, okay, that's a good question, because the thing about an anomalous experience is it doesn't present itself purely in its objective manifestation. Let me give you an example. So you're sitting in your apartment at night. It's quiet, and you hear a noise that shouldn't be in another room. Okay, so you're reading. That disrupts your reading. Like say you hear something fall over, something big. That disrupts your reading. It's like your goal-directed activity has been eliminated. It's like you're alert. You might even wake up if you're asleep, but you're alert. So you walk cautiously. Well, you might run out of the house. That's one way of dealing with it. Or you might phone the police. But let's say you decide to explore. Well, you're conflicted because you're driven towards it, but you're also anxious. So you walk towards the room, and let's say the door is slightly ajar like this. And it's dark in there. And you reach your hand in to turn on the light. You watch what your mind does when you do that. Say, if you watch the pictures that it generates, because it's trying to figure out what the hell's in there, you'll get, well, all sorts of fantasies about the potential thing that might be in the next room. Now, if you actually watch yourself do this, you generate, well, some of the visions will be more or less realistic. Cat got in, maybe it's a burglar. But you also get images that are monstrous-like. That's both a hypothesis that your brain is generating about what might have done it, a warning that something terrible might be in that room, because you really do not want to put your hand in there. And the anomaly all at once. Because it emerges, the anomaly emerges in a sense in already categorized form. That's the thing, you never really encounter chaos per se. As soon as something unexpected happens, it's already presenting itself in the form of a potential hypothesis. So I think your right hemisphere is doing the pattern recognition instantly.
so then it seems like the left hemisphere is the decision maker basically. It just uses the right hemisphere for okay, what is anomalous? Give me the patterns, and then let's see how to use this for my adaptive behavior to get to the.
I think that's how it works. I think the information, if there's a continuum between entirely explored and not explored at all, as information moves from the category of not explored at all to entirely explored, it moves across the hemisphere, so to speak. So the locale of specialization shifts. And there's evidence for this. I mean, the right hemisphere does seem to be the place where activity takes place, most particularly when you don't know what the hell you're doing. Also, the other thing that happens is that, like if you're practicing a new activity, when you first start practicing, huge areas of the cortex light up. And as you get good at it, the area that's involved gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until there's just a tiny center somewhere that's really specialized for that activity. And then it's not conscious anymore. So you do it automatically, like typing or playing the piano.
And that's in the left hemisphere?
Well, I don't know that. I don't know enough about the literature on specialization to tell you. Like, I don't know where motor patterns end up localizing. For example, I don't think anybody knows. We know that the prefrontal cortex is involved in construction and monitoring of motor plans when they're first being formulated. But once they're perfected, where they go seems still somewhat mysterious. The what's that?
Cerebellum?
Yeah, it seems involved in like regulating the smoothness of their application, and the basal ganglia are involved in motor output too. But where those patterns are localized, I don't think anybody knows yet.
It seems a bit brash to generalize the two hemispheres as these sort of absolutely separate units.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're
No,
just
no,
talking
it
about
is.
sort of patterns of activity.
Yes, it is rash, and the thing is that broadly, this is broadly speaking, and I don't think it's so much a matter of hemispheric specialization maybe as whether the information is linguistically mediated or still in image form, or whether it's in image form or still at the level of behavior. So, no, you risk simplification to think of it in terms of hemispheric specialization, but there's still enough useful information to be derived that way to make it worthwhile.
So if you were to look at language, then could you say that the organization of thoughts and all that is left hemisphere, but style and the actual thoughts come from the right hemisphere? 'Cause it doesn't seem right to say.
Well, broadly speaking, again, I would say that there's some evidence for that. Things like style, that is pattern recognition capacity. I mean, that's all, like the font on a given typeface, for example, has nothing to do with the information per se. It's sort of an emergent property, or styles in architecture, literature, and so on. There are patterns that are difficult to, and I think they are related to story and image. So I know, the right hemisphere is specialized for the comprehension of stories. It is specialized for the comprehension of patterns. It's the hemisphere that's responsible for your understanding of music and most nonverbal cues. It's broadly specialized for negative affect. And it's also architectonically constructed so that it has a less differentiated structure than the left hemisphere, which seems to indicate that it's better for quick and dirty analysis. And I think what it does is use metaphor. It says, this unknown thing has the same attributes as all these other unexpected things that you've already encountered, so look out. So, which is useful information. If you don't know anything else about the unknown, it's good to know that it's like all those other things that you already encountered that you didn't understand. I think what's happened in religious systems in large part is that people have constructed images of the unknown, like Kelly, and then used those as ritual models against which to practice patterns of adaptation that are specialized, not for anything particular, but for adaptation to the unknown in general, because that's really what you have to know. Not how to do something, but how to do something when you don't know how to do anything. That's really what you need to know. So you get things like the great goddess who's responsible for death. The only thing to her that's acceptable is a human sacrifice. Well, what does that mean? Well, they're ritually acting out this. It says, to get from here to here, to make an adjustment to the fact of chaos requires constant sacrifice. What a sacrifice of the king, for example. But the king is a pattern of adaptive behavior. Before you can understand that, in image or semantically, you act it out. And that's where those rituals come from. So that placates the goddess. Endless sacrifice. Well, that's right. But what is it? Well, it's endless sacrifice of that thing that you value most, which is in fact, in the abstracted form, your current set of beliefs and your configuration, your view of the world. The thing you want to give up the least, because it's the thing that protects you from emotional chaos. That's what you have to sacrifice all the time in order to adapt to the fact of the unknown. Okay, back to social psychology. I want to read you these things from Iliada. This is very interesting. For religious man, space is not homogeneous. He experiences interruptions and breaks in it. Some parts of space are qualitatively different from others. Draw not nigh hither, says the Lord to Moses. Put off thy shoes from off thy feet. For the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Exodus 3:5. There is then a sacred space, and hence a strong significant space. There are other spaces that are not sacred, and so are without consistency or structure. They're amorphous, they have no definition. Nor is this all. For religious men, this spatial non-homogeneity finds expression in the experience of an opposition between space that is sacred, the only real and really existing space, and all other space, the formless expanse that surrounds it. Okay. It must be said at once that the religious experience of the non-homogeneity of space is a primordial experience. He means by that an archetypal experience. It doesn't have to be learned. It's a structural element of experience. Homologous to the founding of the world. It is not a matter of theoretical speculation, but of a primary religious experience that precedes all reflection on the world. For it is the break effected in space that allows the world to be constituted, because it reveals a fixed point, the central axis for all future orientation. When the sacred manifests itself, there is not only a break in the homogeneity of space, there is also revelation of an absolute reality, opposed to the non-reality of the vast surrounding expanse. The manifestation of the sacred ontologically founds the world. Okay, now what Eliade is trying to say there is that, look, your cognitive systems are founded upon certain presuppositions. And what Eliade is trying to do, and this was what Jung was trying to do too with his identification of the archetypes, is to point out what are the most fundamental levels of presuppositions upon which all the things that you think in fact are based. As Kurt Gödel pointed out, that any internal and consistent system, logical system, is necessarily predicated on presumptions that can't be proved from within the system. They have to be accepted. They're axioms, like the axioms of geometry. This is an axiom. There's defined territory and undefined territory. This is what you protect. This is where you live. It's the establishment of this that is the precondition for everything else you do. So establishing that initial sacred space, that's a religious act. It's the primary religious act. So it is clear to what a degree the discovery, that is the revelation of sacred space, possesses existential value for religious man. For nothing can begin, nothing can be done without a previous orientation, and any orientation implies acquiring a fixed point. It is for this reason that religious man has always sought to fix his abode at the center of the world. That's where the medieval notion that man existed, or that the earth was the center of the cosmos, that's where that idea came from. It wasn't an empirical notion. It was the notion that wherever we live, that's the center, that's defined space, surrounded necessarily by an expansive territory that we haven't explored. Now we already know, too, what to make of that in terms of implications, because we know what unexplored territory signifies. First, it signifies fear, then it signifies promise. So defined territory is security, established in an expanse of anxiety and curiosity. But a priori, it's anxiety. So your village is surrounded by the places you don't go because it's frightening out there. Why is it frightening? No behavioral structures have been erected to make that space habitable. So it's the domain of monsters. It's the domain of wolves. It's the domain of foreigners. It's the domain of barbarians. It's the place that you can't explore. It's like the old maps, the old medieval maps of the world. Defined territory, amorphous edges, surrounded by ocean with monsters. That's what that means. There are monsters out there in unknown territory. It's interesting too, because the monsters always take the form of whales. But whales aren't whales for medieval people, because they didn't know what whales were. They're serpents, sea serpents, that live in the sea. And if you go out there, out beyond explored territory, the sea serpent comes out of the sea and swallows you. That's the hero's mission, right down into the belly of the beast. You might come back and you might not. But what that is the projection of mythology onto the world.
So for the European, the age of exploration was an extraordinary radical event.
Absolutely,
I mean, it's-
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Well, here, I'm going to tell you exactly how radical it was. This is something Eliade is at pains to describe. One of the outstanding characteristics of traditional societies is the opposition that they assume between their inhabited territory and the indeterminate space that surrounds it. The former is the world, more precisely, our world, the cosmos. So when Marduk constructs the cosmos, that's what that means. He's constructing habitable territory, the definable world, out of the amorphous reality that surrounds it. Everything outside the cosmos is no longer cosmos, but a sort of other world, a foreign, chaotic place, peopled by ghosts, demons, foreigners, who are assimilated to demons and to the souls of the dead. Now, this is some other research that I did, so this is an insert. More specifically to the dragon of chaos. Okay, so this is the point here. Your natural category of foreigner is the dragon of chaos. They're in the same category. Not because you've assimilated them together, but because you have not yet distinguished them. They're still the same thing. So your natural response to the foreigner is, he's the thing that isn't human, that occupies the space defined by chaos, whose a priori motivational significance is the generation of terror and disorder. So you say, you don't need an explanation then about why people are hostile to foreigners. What you need is an explanation for those few instances where that does not in fact occur. Okay, among the Hyksos, barbarians were assimilated to Apophis, who devours the sun. No, sorry. Yeah, that's right. The Hyksos were barbarians from the Egyptian point of view. They kept coming into Egypt and disrupting everything. They were assimilated. Hyksos meant barbarians. And they were assimilated to Apophis, who devours the sun. Okay, so that's the Egyptians. Among the Indo-Europeans, the ancestors of the modern Indians, the assimilation of enemies in battle to the slaying of Virta. In fact, enemies were called Virtans. And Virta was the gigantic dragon who held back the waters in the hollow of the mountain. Indra slayed him and constructed the world. So for the Indo-Europeans, the slaying of enemies was precisely equivalent to the act that constructed the world. And that is because when you slay your enemies, you expand your territory, and the expansion of territory is equivalent to the construction of the world. It's a heroic enterprise. You're battling the enemies of the state. Among the Zoroastrians in Iran, he who triumphs in a battle, he truly kills, the fight of the hero Pratona against the dragon Azidehaka is recounted as the struggle of King Feridun against a foreign usurper, the dragon Azdahak. Again, it's the same story. This is an Iranian story. Foreigners are the dragon of chaos. They bring disorder into the state. So to overthrow the foreigner, to establish new territories, to do the same thing that the deity did when he established the world. Now, okay. At first sight, this cleavage in space appears to be due to the opposition between an inhabited and organized, hence cosmicized territory, and the unknown space that extends beyond its frontiers. On one side there's a cosmos, on the other side a chaos. But we shall see that if every inhabited territory is a cosmos, this is precisely because it was first consecrated, because in one way or another it is the work of the gods or is in communication with the world of the gods, who determine destiny in that territory, and who therefore constitute the organizing principles of the society, the dominance hierarchy that rules there. That's the thing, you know, inside sacred space, you're pursuing a goal that's shared by everyone else that's in that space, so their behavior is all rendered predictable as a consequence of their participation in the same story. It's a religious story that's defined by the dominance of a certain god. So when you go out into new territory, the first thing you do is consecrate that new territory to the God that rules your territory, so that order reigns there. That means the world's created. And what it means that order reigns there is that whenever other people go there, they have to behave the same way you behave, so they're predictable. So that means they're out of the domain that's defined by chaos, and they don't terrify you. They don't undermine. They don't pose the possibility of undermining everything that it is that you believe in. So Eliade says, all this appears very clearly from the Vedic ritual for taking possession of a territory. Possession becomes legally valid through the erection of a fire altar consecrated to Agni. This is a quote from the religious text, the Shatapatha Brahmana. One says that one is installed when one has built a fire altar, and all those who build the fire altar are legally established. Okay, so this is rules for encountering new territory. By the erection of a fire altar, Agni is made present. You see, the erection of a fire altar, that's a symbol of the construction of civilization, right? I mean, because the mastery of fire is something that's absolutely integral to the establishment of order. Anyways. But the meaning of the ritual is far more complex, and if we consider all of its ramifications, we shall understand why concentrating a territory is equivalent to making it a cosmos. For in fact, the erection of an altar to Agni is nothing but the reproduction on the microcosmic scale of the creation. The water in which the clay is mixed, the clay for the altar, is assimilated to the primordial water, chaos. The clay that forms the base of the altar symbolizes the earth. The lateral walls represent the atmosphere, and so on. And the building of the altar is accompanied by songs that proclaim which cosmic region has just been created. Hence the erection of a fire altar, which alone validates taking possession of a new territory, is equivalent to the construction of the world. An unknown, foreign, and unoccupied territory, which usually means unoccupied by our people, still shares in the fluid and larval modality of chaos. By occupying it, and above all by settling it, man symbolically transforms it into a cosmos through a ritual repetition of the creation of the world. What is to become our world must first be created, and every creation has a paradigmatic model, the creation of the universe by the gods. When the Scandinavian colonists took possession of Iceland and cleared it, they regarded the enterprise neither as an original undertaking, nor as human and profane work. For them the labor was the repetition of a primordial act, the transformation of chaos into cosmos by the divine act of creation. When they tilled the deserted soil, they were in fact repeating the act of the gods who had organized chaos by giving it a structure, forms, and norms. Whether it is a case of clearing uncultivated ground or of conquering and occupying a territory already inhabited by other human beings, ritual taking possession must always repeat the cosmogony. For in the view of archaic societies, everything that is not our world is not yet the world. A territory can only be made ours by creating it anew. This religious behavior in respect to unknown lands continued even in the West down to the dawn of modern times. The Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors, discovering and conquering territories, took possession of them in the name of Jesus Christ. The raising of the cross was equivalent to consecrating the country, hence in some way to a new birth. For through Christ old things are passed away. Behold, all things become new. 2 Corinthians 5:17. The newly discovered country was renewed, recreated by the cross. Of course, and when the Americans landed on the moon, the first thing they did was put up the American flag. It's a profane repetition of precisely the same notions. This undiscovered territory is now part of the world. Order rules there, not chaos. So.
Also, it's explored through the ritual after that, because like in the, what was it from the Satapatha Brahmana? Agni is like the fire goddess, that's the god of transformation. So if you're transforming that land from that which is unexplored to that which is explored,
right,
and thereby making it simultaneously sacred, part of that sacred territory?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. And the ritual that you undergo when you're creating the fire temple is equivalent to participating in the act, for example, that's defined by Marduk,
Right.
which is the fighting with the dragon that's represented. See, I think this, you might think this is completely off the wall, but I've thought about it for a long time. It makes a certain amount of sense to me. Chaos is represented by a dragon. But why? Why a dragon? There aren't any dragons. I mean, it's partly because a dragon is a creature of matter, because it's a serpent and it goes around on the ground and has wings, so it's also a creature of the air. So it's a symbol of the union of opposites. And it's also a serpent, so it can shed its skin and be reborn, so there's an element of transformation in there. But I also saw this great picture. It's a picture from a medieval church. It's called Souls in the Grip of Hell. And there's a picture of this monstrous dragon, and inside it, it's wood, it's a carving. Inside it, there's all these people who have horrified expressions on their face, but they've been devoured by a serpent. Now, we share our ascending spinal tracts and our limbic system with animals going a long ways back on the phylogenetic chain. And our limbic system, the hippocampus, is as old as amphibians. In fact, the hippocampus first made its appearance when our ancestors crawled out of the water, which is kind of interesting from a symbolic perspective. I think the reason that the dragon of chaos is symbolized by a dragon is because when we fall into that, our actions and affects are dominated by parts of our brain that are so old that they still partake in the aspect of the world that's defined by by reptilian potency. Anyways, you can think about that. I mean, I've debated whether or not to make a point of that in this manuscript, because it seems to be kind of a strange notion, but the fact is there are dragons everywhere in the world, and they're representative of something.
Okay, so we think in these ways and draw these distinctions naturally. It's not a feature of the object. So we would tend to think in these
Well, it
ways.
depends on how you define the object.
Right, but I mean, we would tend to think in these ways even when the territory that we're exploring isn't a spatial object, even if it's something abstract like a concept or a theory.
Absolutely. Look, our ideological concepts, especially ideological concepts, are actually abstract representations of adaptive behavioral patterns. They're not descriptions of the objective world. Like if you share Marxist ideology is a body of laws, which basically means that it's a verbal representation of a pattern of action that's designed to transform order into chaos. Chaos into order, although with the Marxists it works the other way around. So that's right. Your ideological identification is in fact your identification with a god of behavior that's become abstracted into a higher order philosophy.
Okay, but don't you think that, I mean, obviously in those situations, then you can use that as an impetus to fight or to have war, but don't you
Right.
think that in some cases, the fact that it's not a spatial object or a literal possession or territory or land might change the way that we approach it? I mean, we'd still approach it in the same way in our minds, but the consequences would
No,
be-
I think it's worse. I think it's worse because look, if you take an animal and you train it so that it's adapted to a territory, you can't come along and have an argument with it and thereby undermine its whole sequence of adaptations. Like once the animal's got its adaptation fixed, about the only thing you can do to really foul it up is to shift its environment, like you can move it somewhere else. But if you have abstracted your pattern of adaptation up into an ideology that's verbally mediated, and I come along with a set of principles that make logical nonsense of some of your presuppositions, I can blow apart whole schemes of your adaptation in the course of, say, an afternoon. And it might take a long time for the consequences of that to, like, have their effect on all your structures of adaptation. But the point is that once I transform my adaptations into words, I can adapt abstractly, and that's really useful, right? I mean, I can build potential adaptive models in the abstract without having to act them out. That's the positive side.
Right.
But the negative side is once I can abstract up the principles, I'm really vulnerable to an argument. And what an argument is a war that's fought with words. And if it fails, then we just cascade down the chain of abstraction to the actual conflict.
Well,
So,
I'm not really asking about ideology, so I guess what I'm trying to get at is something more like, if there is a fertile valley 10 miles outside of my border, and you're there, if I'm not going to cooperate with you, I have to kill you in order for me to have that, in order for me to explore it and for it to be mine. But if I'm studying astrophysics, and you're an astrophysicist in China, I don't necessarily have to kill you in order for me to be able to study even the exact same thing that you're studying. I mean,
But you
for
might
me
have to
explore
symbolically
it.
kill this person by firing off letters undermining the
sure.
quality of their work.
Yeah, look, that's a good example, because there's no necessary reason why a scientific model has to simultaneously take on the affective valence of an adaptational model. But to the degree that your career is contaminated with your ideas, you're going to respond to your competitors as if they were enemies. So if you've abstracted yourself from your objective ideas, which basically means if you have a life that's independent of your scientific beliefs, then you can treat them as objective elements and there's no necessary reason for you to get your emotions involved. But the truth, like the real situation tends not to be that way. It's that people get their objective pictures tangled up with their religious beliefs, and then they do view attacks on their domain as personal attacks. Now, you're not supposed to do that in science. In fact, science is actually the mechanism whereby we separate those two types of models, but it doesn't always work. So
it seems like if you're like when you're literally exploring the actual physical world, it's absolutely inevitable that there's going to be physical violence and conflict, and there's no even possibility of getting around that. I mean, in principle, that is a necessary part of it. But then, so is it wrong to say then that when you're no longer studying the physical world and when you're studying more abstract things, that most likely you're probably still going to behave the same way, but there's at least the possibility that you can...
no, I wouldn't say, no, I wouldn't say that. Like, I don't think, if you're studying things that are objective, you have in principle the possibility of being objective about them.
But I mean, we
Okay.
have to fight over it. If there's one thing and we both want it and we won't cooperate, we must
You
fight.
can share it. I mean, like a valley,
Right.
two people can
Right.
farm it.
Right. There are, like, your first premise was that the bloodshed was a necessary intermediary.
Okay.
But that's not, one of the things we want to do in this course is, the reason that I'm interested in the structure of myths to begin with is to figure out, look, here's your alternatives. If I let your ideas into my head, then I end up in chaos. That's one option. Okay, so I don't let your ideas into my head by killing you. That's another option. Now, both of those options seem to me to be pretty distressing. You can't expect me to give up everything I believe in just because you have a different idea. By the same token, if the only way that we can settle our disputes is through force, and you have an atom-bomb and I have one, well, that's pretty much the end of the story there too. So it's sort of anxiety, depression, and the possibility of suicide and cultural degeneration on one side, or like conflict that will kill us both on the other side, right? Those are, you might describe those as the horns of a dilemma. But then the question is, well, given that dilemma, is there an alternative path? Well, that's what we're hopefully going to define, mostly in the second part of the course. Because that's the dilemma. It's a terrible dilemma. I mean, before, if you had axes, stone axes, and sticks, and so did I, and we had a fight, well, there was at least the possibility that one of our groups wasn't going to end up dead. But now, when we're talking about territorial disputes between powers that are fully armed, the possibility for settling the problem violently doesn't even exist, unless you'd be willing to kill me, unless you'd be willing to die just to kill me, which of course is always a possibility. Depends on how deep your desire for revenge actually is.
So the middle road is always compromise, right? I mean, because if you have an argument with someone, maybe you take a little of their idea, and they take enough of yours so that you can get along.
Well, that's.
And if you have a more sort of physical situation, you just compromise in terms of getting what you want. Isn't that exactly what culture is compromise, so that everyone?
Well,
you all
certainly, at
compromise
least in part
because-
compromise, because if you and I are modifying our behavior in some territory, part of it's dispute, but part of it's, well, if you do this, I'll reward you, and if I do this, you'll reward me, and so like, it's positive mutual modification.
But also, I can't have everything I could possibly want. I mean, if I could just have everything I could possibly want, I could not function in society at all.
Right. You give, well, what you do is essentially, theoretically, is you give up some immediate gratification for the long-term possibility of continued stable gratification. I mean, that's one way of looking at it.
Or at least
So-
for being able to live in society, which
Right.
you have to do.
Right, exactly. That's the social contract sort of notion,
Right.
you know. So, but you said compromise, and I would say, well, rather, so if, here's your negative option one, which is I kill you, and here's negative option two, which is I listen to you and thereby lose all my faith, well, then the question is, like, is there some mediating principle that isn't either of these that can be used instead of them? And I would say, well, that's why we're studying what Marduk represents, because I would say at the core of all belief systems is a representation of the process by which the belief system was erected, which is the most important thing about the belief system. So if you have belief system A that you're like dogmatically attached to, and I have belief system B and I'm dogmatically attached to, and I point out to you that despite our differences at the core, the most important thing is something that we actually both agree about that might help in some way smooth the possibility of transition. It would also make us at least reasonable negotiators because, well, here's an example. You have to see, if I want to negotiate with you, we need a higher order point of reference. That defines the rules, because otherwise I might make an agreement with you and then just like cut you into shreds the first chance I get, right? So you have to be able to trust me, even to begin the process of negotiation. So I would say, well, this is a weird example, but let's say in the Christian marriage ceremony, you might think of that as the union of two disparate territories. Well, the notion is that the male and the female are supposed to subordinate themselves to the process that Christ represents. That's Marduk and Horus, etc., and Indra and Buddha. And why is that? Well, it's because this person has, their story, and this person has their story, and the union of the stories produces a lot of unknown territory, like right away. And in order to mediate between the two, you need a higher order principle, which says, so that's the rule. So it's like, okay, I'll negotiate with you, but you have to trust me and vice versa. We have to put the possibility of trust above all our disputes. So you'd say, well, trust is one of the aspects here, et cetera, et cetera. So then we have a higher order point of reference to mediate our disputes. So I'm saying, well, if this is one territory and this is another, we need to find out what rules the unexplored spaces in between so that when we get there, we know how to act.
Can I ask one more question about that similar sort of thing? What if the type of thing that you want to explore isn't the type of thing that inherently precludes, like, there are some types of things that if I want to have it, I must keep everyone else from having it in order that I can have it.
Yeah, that's the zero-sum game.
Right, and there are other sorts of things that aren't that way. Like, for instance, if I just had this dispute that I couldn't resolve with the Chinese astrophysicist, I would not necessarily need to even acknowledge that he was studying something. I mean, I don't.
Well, that's
have to-
true. Okay, look, there are going to be.
Like, I wouldn't have to fight a war.
If-
I would not have
no,
to either kill him or give up
If
my
this
goal.
is your story and this is his story, you've both established domains of reality. Cosmos, I don't know what the plural of that is.
By definition.
Yeah, anyways, as long as he's studying phenomena that are irrelevant to your pursuits,
But even if he's studying the exact same thing, I do not have to keep him from studying it just so that I can study it. So I do not have to kill
sure,
him.
as long as
What's your-
the implications of what he discovers have no negative significance for your ongoing story. That's
Yeah.
the bottom
Because
line.
it seems like when you're like limited just solely to the physical world, like landscapes and rivers and who's going to own the valley, then if you're not going to cooperate and you're not going to give up your goal, you have to kill them. But if it's an abstracted thing, like you're not studying a particular tree or a particular ant, but you're just studying a concept.
There's
even if
enough
you want to study
unexplored
the
territory
exact-
for everyone.
Yeah, and even if he wants to study the exact same bit of territory,
Well,
it doesn't mean
economists
that-
make that argument about limited territory too, all the time, as they say, because there are some economists who basically follow, what's the population theorist who said we were all destined to starve? Malthus, yeah, there's some economists who take a Malthusian perspective, which is that everything's a zero-sum game and so the competition for resources is necessary. And there's others who say, well, no, that's not true because you redefine territory by transforming your adaptive structure, and that means that what may look like bounded territory is only bounded because of the way that you approach it. And if you think of a new way to approach it, well, then there's plenty of resources for all. And so far, the non-Malthusians, I think, are winning the argument, which is to say that territory is defined by your behavior in it, not by any objective aspects of the territory. So,
Yeah, isn't there a distinction between struggle over goods and really, these are really structures of belief? I mean, it seems like you can show the
I would
goods
say,
now.
not usually, because what constitutes a good is always construed in relationship to the pursuit of a goal. It's like, we fight wars over oil in the 20th century, but we wouldn't fight wars over oil in the 19th century, because the affective valence of petroleum has shifted as a consequence of a shift in our environmental structure. So, and that's a natural good, so to speak, but like I don't buy the concept of natural resource. I think there's a real flaw in logic somewhere there, because natural resource plays the same role in economic theory as stimuli does in psychology.
Yeah, I mean something different, like,
Oh, okay.
we agree that oil is a good and so we're fighting over it.
Yeah,
That's one thing. Then to say that I look at the world in such a way that, I look at the world very differently. I look at the world in such a way that your way of looking at the world is inherently a threat to it, because it's different from mine. And so it's not exactly that we can compromise. We have to come up with some integrative principle.
right,
some way
absolutely.
in
That's
which
why
we
I was
can-
disputing the notion of
Which is different than
compromise.
fighting over oil, it seems to me.
Yes, I would say, yes.
Because we can't, in other words, we have to get to some other level, so to speak. It's
Yes,
not
we should do that
compromising
with the
it.
fight over oil too, because there should be a higher, theoretically at least, there might be a higher order set of principles to which we would be willing to subordinate our competition for oil.
Yeah.
I mean, and it seems, I don't think it's unreasonably utopian to presume that in the long run, it would be better if we could get as much as possible for everyone. It would be like, from the selfish perspective, better. Like, I think it was a historically anomalous event, for example, that the Americans rebuilt Japan instead of burning it to the ground and plowing it under with salt, which is your more standard human response to a demolished enemy. And it was, the same might be said about Germany. But the addition of Japan to the world economic power strikes me as a net benefit, even to the victors.
Because there
at
was a
least
greater
now.
evil, which was
Well,
Soviet Union.
Well, that, plus the Japanese are online, so to speak. We have access to the creative intelligence of an additional several 100 million people, or however many people inhabit Japan. So it's not a zero-sum game. There's no necessary reason to construe it as a zero-sum game. It can be played that way, but I think it's an error. So that eliminates the notion of the distinction between like limited resources and ideas, because resources are ideas.
Well, see, when I look at ideas and I see this danger that, you can get ideologies and fight wars over them, but on the other hand, to me, it seems to present a more optimistic playing field, because just if we have this drive to explore that must be satisfied, and we want to explore the physical environment instead of abstract ideas, we must fight. We must either cooperate or fight, because if there's one object and that there aren't duplicate copies of it, and only one person can explore it, I must fight with someone.
I see what
But
you're,
if
I
it's
see
an
what you're
idea, we
driving
can
at.
both explore it independently.
Well,
We don't even need to talk to each other.
I always kind of thought that the space race was good for that, for precisely that reason. It's a great outlet for necessary exploratory tendencies. It would not necessarily, I see what you mean.
Yeah, haven't you been saying all along that the whole point of abstraction, sort of in terms of evolutionary development, is so that you can figure out what's good and bad without actually going out there and getting slaughtered by
Right.
what's bad?
Right.
And so that therefore, our whole cultural system is being abstracted so that you can do these things
Yes,
without actually.
but it has the problem with it is that it has this attendant danger that we haven't discussed, which is
Right,
that
it can cascade down,
right,
yes, but it
and you
doesn't.
can also blow your whole system. It's like
Right.
I think that's what we did when the science. I guess I should. It's not quite 3. When the scientific revolution came about, the discoveries of the scientific revolution in abstracted form seemed to contradict the presumptions of the religious systems upon which we erected our adaptational structures. So the consequence of abstraction was that we could destroy our belief systems, and that brought on an existential crisis. So the problem with abstraction is, yes, you can explore the abstract, it's very powerful, but you can also be undermined really easily by words. So another reason that it's really useful to study mythology, I think, is because it gives your ideology, your necessary belief, the kind of firm ground that can no longer be undermined easily by a few casual words. Because you're no longer, if you think about it as a tree, you're way up here in the branches, you haven't got the foggiest clue what's down here. It's all unconscious, so to speak, which is to say it's all procedural, or it's still embedded in images. Somebody can come along and give you a bit of harassment here, and it blows your whole adaptational structure apart. You hate that. I mean, it's very hard on you, but that's mostly because you don't know what's down here. So your house is built on shifting sand and not on a rock, and the point is you're supposed to, this ties in with the Philosopher's Stone imagery that we'll get to in the second half of the course, but the idea is that you're supposed to build your house on a rock, and the point is you have to figure out what that rock is. And that's part of the reason why we're spending so much time discussing this pattern of adaptation. Because if you know that in your belief system is a description of the process by which belief systems are generated, and that's the thing that you need to know above all else, well, it makes you much more resistant to casual disruption of your adaptational structure. Because you know what you should do when you don't know what to do, which is the thing you need to know the most. So.
Yeah, just for the reading, are we supposed to read all of the entire texts in the Advent reading?
Oh, that's a good question. The simple answer would be yes. Let me see. Well, Use and Abuse of History is pretty short. The Basic Writings of Nietzsche, no, you don't have to read all that. Read Beyond Good and Evil, as much of it as you can. It's very difficult to read, but it's very useful. The Great Mother, well, look, the reason I assigned The Great Mother is because that's the most comprehensive survey I know of the symbolism of novelty, basically, of the Great Mother. And what you should do is go through it and get familiar with what it is that Newman's saying. Basically, all he's doing is saying, well, there's he thinks it's the collective unconscious, by the way, which is right in a sense. There's a domain that's the unknown. It has a positive side and negative side. Here's the symbols that have accumulated around that domain in representation. If you read that, go through it enough so that you get a feel for the language of the symbols, which basically means you have to understand when you see a statue of Diana who has a multitude of breasts, you have to understand what that image signifies. And when you see Kelly, who who's eating someone she's giving birth to, you have to be able to see it, not as a foreign artifact, but as a representation of something that you understand. So you have to read that book enough till you get the language. The reason for that is because unless you understand those mythological representations, you have no idea how terrifying the thing is that you want to avoid. Because in normal circumstances, in our well-protected existences, we never ever encounter anything that scares us badly enough to let us know how scared we could be. If you look at these mythological representations, you can get an abstract notion of how terrifying unexplored territory really is. And it's very useful. It gives instant insight into the artistic productions of archaic cultures. So, and the origins and history of consciousness, well, that's basically the best book that I know of that describes hero mythology. So again, you have to go through these enough so that you get the gist of what the authors are trying to describe. Like in The Great Mother, Newman describes the symbolism of novelty. In The Origins and History of Consciousness, he describes the symbolism of the process that explores novelty. So again, you want to get a picture of it, because then you'll start understanding references to heroes and so on as we proceed through the course.
Are these in order and sequence?
No, not really. Not really. Not really.